sermonic moment too, trying to think what will illustrate this best. Okay, this is not a biblical text, but in our sermon this morning, we're going to sing a song together that talks about gay, happy meetings. What does that mean? There may be some of our younger people in the audience going to snicker out loud when we all sing gay, happy meetings, because their definition of the word gay is not your definition. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does this make sense? Well, if I'm looking at a biblical text and I come across a word like that, I may end up doing something very different with the text than I should because I don't understand what this word is in its current usage or in its previous usage. And so I need to make a careful and thorough reading of the text. Nothing substitutes for that. All right? They also say, number 2, consider the original context, literary and historical. All right, that's what we've been doing here in Jeremiah 29. We tried to take a look. Is there a graduation ceremony at stake here? There's not. What is at stake? Life in the exile. All right? A simple historical study cued me into that. You say, well, how do I do that, Devin? I don't have commentaries. One of the best things you can do is buy a study Bible. You know, I've got here the ESV study Bible, and I've taken years of notes in here, but I've got, you know what a study Bible is. It's got footnote after footnote. When I look at the beginning of this, I will see that there are some of the best biblical scholars in the world that have worked on this translation. And that's good. You need a good translation of the Bible to begin with. Okay? Any translation of the Bible that was produced in committee should be fine for your study of the Bible. All right, what do I mean by that, produced in committee? A committee translation is a translation that was put together not by one person, but by a group of people from all across the religious spectrum. And so this ESV study Bible was put together by Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and Church of Christers and Catholics. What does that mean? What does that really mean? Some of you have always thought that you'd look at a Bible and go, well, I see a doctrinal bias here. No, you don't. Blatant doctrinal biases are checked and balanced in committee translation. Okay? Committee translation means that there have been checks and balances. So you've got Gordon Fee, who's a very well-known New Testament scholar. Plieben says, I love Gordon Fee. Gordon Fee is one of the only, real academic biblical scholars who comes from the Pentecostal holiness movement. Why? Well, most of us in this room think that the Pentecostal holiness movement's got some problems, okay? Well, if Gordon Fee is the guy who's going to be translating and writing about those passages with spiritual gifts, he may insert on his own some ideas in there that other biblical scholars would say, that's not going to cut it. That's not what that says. And so he's going to be checked out. We still need his input. We still need his understanding. We still need his knowledge of the text, but he is not going to get away with that in committee translation. Okay? Checks and balances. If you come across something in your NIV that you think is blatant doctrinal bias, it may be that you don't understand the doctrine. If you read about predestination and you get all upset about it because they use the word predestination, maybe you need to study predestination. Okay? It may not be the translation that's the problem. It may be our understanding that's the problem. All right, so what kind of translations are committee translation? King James is a committee translation. NIV, RSV, NRSV. The Message is not. Okay? The Message was translated by a very well-known New Testament scholar named Eugene Peterson. I read Peterson a lot. I make my ministry students read Peterson a lot because he's got great insight. Peterson translated the Message on the train into work every morning to read it to his little children at night so that they would understand it. So guess what? All of his ideas come through glaringly in the text. Now, sometimes I really enjoy reading the Message because it gives me a different way to view it. But I would not use that for my major source of biblical study. Okay? So a committee translation. And Jack Lewis, who's one of the great biblical scholars in the Churches of Christ, who, if you have a 1984 NIV, Lewis led the translating committee that was on Harding's campus through some of the minor prophets books, particularly Joel and Amos. If you have a 1984 NIV, the study notes at the bottom for Joel and Amos were written by Jack Lewis, one of my major professors, a Harding professor, an elder in a conservative Church of Christ in Memphis. People used to ask Jack all the time, what translation would you use? Because Jack had 2 PhDs, one in Greek and one in Hebrew. And they said, if anybody ought to know what translation we ought to use, it should be Jack Lewis. And they said, Brother Lewis, what translation would you use? And he always said, whichever one you'll read. Whichever one you'll read. He said, I grew up memorizing the King James Version. When I got into academia, they wanted the Revised Standard Version. Then I've spent my career working on this NIV translation. He says, when I open my mouth now, God only knows what's going to come out. Okay? But which version you will read, that's a big consideration. So careful and thorough reading of the text. You know what you might want to do? There are translations that'll have, or publications, that'll have 3 or 4 translations and columns across the page. Have you seen those? And this was really easy to do if you have internet access. You can pull up something like Bible Gateway or BlueLetterBible.com, and you can pull up several translations and compare them. Compare them. And you'll see different translational approaches, different decisions that have been made. Sometimes you'll see down in the footnote, some translations say this, or some texts say this. Well, they've had to make a decision on that, and they've done the best that they can. So careful, thorough reading of the text, taking all of that into consideration. Let me stop right now. I've been talking a lot. You might have a question. Floyd.
What is the definition of text? Are we talking about a verse? Can it be a character study? Can it even be part of a verse? What are we talking about, the study of the text?
Okay, that is a great question. I'm going to tell you what I teach my students, and then I'll tell you what I was taught growing up. I teach my students that a text is a literary unit of biblical thought. A literary unit of biblical thought. Now, translators such as in the ESV and the NIV have divided the text into paragraphs. That's very helpful at understanding what a text is. All right? This text is a thought unit. Okay? And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes they do a real good job of that. In Ephesians 5, they have not. Okay? Let's go to Ephesians 5 so I can illustrate what Floyd's talking about here. And I'm not going to get in any hurry in this. As far as I know, I'm teaching this class till the Lord returns. So we'll just take our time going through this. Go to Ephesians 5. Floyd has asked the question, what are we talking about when we say studying a text? Okay. I have the ESV Study Bible that has chapter 5 divided up into 1, 2, 3, 4 separate paragraphs. Does anybody have anything similar to that? Now, some translations, I think older, maybe King James versions and American Standard versions, translated a verse at a time, right? And put it like that on the page. Okay, that's fine, but you may lose some of the context there because you don't know what goes together and what doesn't. All right, now, my ESV Study Bible has made some decisions here. If you'll notice, well, if you're looking at my Bible, I have headings in front of all those paragraphs, right? Like in verse 22, right before verse 22, I have a little heading there that says husbands and wives. Do you have anything like that in yours? Okay, you know that's not inspired, right? That's the translator and the publisher trying to help you understand what's there, all right? But that's not inspired. Now, this is the exact point of the question that Floyd is raising. What is a text? I'm going to start reading in verse 15. Look carefully then how you walk. Oh, then, look carefully then. Anybody have another word other than then? Do you have a therefore? You got a therefore, Dotsy? I've got a then. What's therefore? It's continuing something. So whatever's about to be said is based on what was said previously. So before I go any further in this, I better figure out what was said previously because he's drawing on something. Okay, you know that. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Therefore, don't be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Now, he has argued in the beginning of chapter 5, you want to follow the example of God, you want to live like beloved children, you do not want to follow the example of the Gentile pagans. Okay, that's what he's argued. So look carefully how you walk, not as foolish, but as wise, understand what the Lord's will is. Now here's a particular application of that will. Don't get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery. Now, that's a word I need to look up. I mean, I think I know what it means. Because when people get drunk, they get naked and dance on tables. I've heard. So I think I know what debauchery is, but I want to look it up. I want to make sure I know. Anybody have a word other than debauchery right there? Dissipation. Oh, great. That helped a lot. Yeah. Dissipation. Okay. So. Because that'll ruin your life. And I bet you're reading out of the Message, aren't you? What is that? What translation is that?
New Living Translation.
Okay, New Living Translation. That's a committee translation. It's a decent translation. It's a good translation. Because that'll ruin your life. That'll lead to debauchery. Okay, I need to look that word up, but I get the impression it means it'll make you do things you ought not to do. Okay? Don't get drunk on the wine, for that's debauchery, but instead be filled with the Spirit, which leads to something else. Now, if I'm carefully reading this, I can play with this a little bit. Don't get drunk on wine, get drunk on the Spirit. Don't be filled with the spirits, be filled with the Spirit, right? You see that there's a parallel that's coming up here. Don't live like this, unwise, drunk all the time, living in debauchery like the pagans. Live like this, wise, pursuing the Lord's will, being filled with His Spirit, because that leads to, watch this, addressing one another, not naked dancing on tables, but in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord in your heart, giving thanks always for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. All right, just like getting drunk on wine leads to a kind of lifestyle, getting drunk on the Spirit leads to another kind of lifestyle. The kind of lifestyle that the Spirit leads to is praise, thanksgiving, and submission. Now, the bell is rung, so I can go ahead and go into this and know that the bell is going to save me. We often use this text to support our practice of a cappella worship. Grasp the text in their town. Is that what this paragraph's about? Okay, now listen, for all of you visitors here, before you go out and put on Facebook or call one of our elders and tell them I'm a heretic, I am firmly in the camp of a cappella music in the church. Firmly. Okay? I do like listening to David Crowder, but I'm firmly within the a cappella traditions of the churches of Christ. I will teach you all about that before this class is over. But that is not what this paragraph is about. And people who study the Bible, when we come up to them and say, you're going to hell for using instruments because this text, they look at us like we're nuts. Because that's not what this text teaches. Okay? To grasp the meaning in their town is to come away with something different than maybe what we always thought about this text. Are there reasons we sing a cappella? Yes, I'm all for them. I teach them, okay? You're not going to get me fired on this one. But that's not what this text teaches. Okay? And it's got a sister text in Colossians, doesn't teach that either. There's something totally different going on here. Okay? Now, back to Floyd's question. What is a text? All right, look at the last line of this paragraph. All right, so be filled with the Spirit that leads to praise, that's the singing and making melody, giving thanks, that's the giving thanks, and then submission to one another. Which leads directly into verse 22. Wives, submit to your own husbands. Husbands, I know it says die to your wives, it's the same, it's submission. Submit to your wives. Children, submit to your parents. Parents, submit to your children. Slaves, submit to masters. Masters, submit to slaves. What is taught here is mutual submission in the family unit based on the Spirit leading of God. Here's the question. Does the statement, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, belong with what goes with the above, about being filled with the Spirit? Or does it go with what follows about familial relationships? Joe says yes. Okay? All right. How many of you have translations where verse 22, where verse 21 is in the paragraph with verse 22? All right, Bob, verse 21 it begins a new paragraph, and I bet it's in the imperative, like submit to one another, right?
Honor Christ and put others first.
Okay, honor Christ and put others first. But that verse 21 begins a new paragraph, right? In my translation, it ends the previous paragraph. Somebody made a decision when they were doing Bob's translation that this begins a new thought with an imperative. Somebody that did my translation says, no, this goes with what preceded, defining what it means to be filled with the Spirit. Which one is it? Well, I think, Joe, you're right. I think it's both. I think that's Paul's natural launching point into his next section about how households live when they're filled with the Spirit and trying to imitate God and Christ. Okay? But that's just what it is. It's a pivot point. It's a springboard into his next. The only way we live mutually submissive lives is to be filled with the Spirit. Because filled with the old spirit, we don't submit to nothing and nobody. You understand? I ain't submitting to nothing. I'm my own man. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps and forget you. It's only by the Spirit of God that I can, with humility and patience and, wait a minute, Paul, Ephesians 4, with all humility and gentleness and with patience, bearing with one another in love. That's what leads to submission. Those are all anti-Devon. They're anti-you too, unless you're filled with the Spirit. Once you're filled with the Spirit, you see that there's a new way of living that ends up in submission, which then affects the way. So the question, Floyd, is how am I going to preach this? Am I going to preach this about what happens when you're filled with the Spirit? Am I going to preach this about what happens in the home? And the answer is I'll do two sermons. I'll start here and I'll carry over the implications there. Even though they're in two different paragraphs, it's one thought that dominates the whole section. Does that make sense? Does any of this make sense? Okay. We'll pick up with here next week.